Good evening, ladies and gentlemen, and welcome to Shelton High School for tonight's Teaching American History ranked special presentation, While the World Watched. Ladies and gentlemen, please welcome me in joining our honorary guest this evening, Ms. Carolyn McKinstry.
Thank you so much. What an honor and a privilege it is to join you today, to stand before you and just talk a little bit about where I've evolved from and just to share a bit of the history of Birmingham with you. To set the tone for the stories that I share with you, I'd like to begin by reading from the Birmingham segregation laws. This is one of the documents that I carry with me everywhere that I go. I'm reading to you from section 369, and it's called Separation of the Races. It shall be unlawful to conduct a restaurant or other place for the serving of food in the city, at which white and colored persons are served in the same room, unless such white and colored persons are effectually separated by a solid partition extending from the floor upward to a distance of 7 feet or higher, and unless a separate entrance from the street is provided for each race, for each compartment. My parents came to Birmingham, Alabama when I was 2 years old. They had lived in a little place called Clanton, Alabama. It's very near Selma, and it's very near Montgomery, Alabama. And they were teachers down in those areas, but both received jobs in Birmingham, so they came to Birmingham with the hopes of a brand new life and a better life for their children. One of the first things that they did was to join the 16th Street Baptist Church. 16th Street Baptist Church had its own history before the bombing of the church. You know about it because of the bombing, but it had its own history prior to that. It was the very first black church that was ever built in Alabama and in Birmingham. It was a wonderful place to be as a child. We had all kinds of activities. Even though Birmingham was very segregated, we did not miss anything. We had wonderful picnics and Easter egg hunts, and we had the opportunities to go swimming and to play in parks, play ball, and so forth. And all of this was very important because in Birmingham, everything public was only open to whites. So the church provided an opportunity for us to do all of those things that we could not do. We could not go to the public library. We had a black student who won an international art contest but could not view his work because the work was on display in the Birmingham Public Library, and blacks were not allowed to be in the library. When my mom would try to shop for clothes for school, I had 4 brothers and in later years 1 sister, but we were not permitted to try on the clothes. She would just hold the jeans up, trying to ensure that there was enough room, enough fit there to get them through the school year. We could not work in the stores. We could not eat in the restaurants if they had restaurants, and we could not use any of the public facilities. So the church did a wonderful job. In fact, we didn't know that we were missing a lot of the things that were out there, a lot of fun things. We did know that these things were there, but in my house, it was always about money. When we asked my mom if we could go to Kittyland, for example, and those of you that have read King's letter from the Birmingham jail where he talks about his children wanting to go to Fair Park, we called it Kittyland. Some people call it Fair Park, but black people couldn't go there. And my parents would always say, well, who has money to go to Kittyland? Who has money for Fair Park? When they opened the very first fast food place in Birmingham was a Jack's Hamburger, and we were so excited about the notion of French fries. We had tasted them, and we couldn't wait to get our hands on French fries. But once again, my parents said, well, who has money for French fries? You know, we can buy groceries for a whole week with what it would take to feed you guys. And my brothers did eat a lot. I had 4 really big brothers, and they still do eat a lot. But because of segregated Birmingham, my parents they tried to involve us in as many things as they could to protect us, but they were also very, very strict. I told the class this morning that when I graduated high school, I'd never had a date, that my prom date's father came and picked me up, and he and I rode in the back seat of the car while his father drove us to the prom, and when the prom was over, he brought me back home in the back seat, sitting with my date. But I wasn't allowed to spend the night with anyone or to babysit or do any of those kind of things that seemingly are normal things for teenagers today. I could always get permission to go to church. My parents were big church goers, so this is one reason I spent so much time at the church. My father had served in the Army. He's very strict, very rigid, very unyielding man. He had a master's degree in physics and chemistry. And he would walk around the house spouting formulas sometime and talking about physics and how much he loved physics and chemistry. And I would just wonder, how is it possible to love physics and chemistry? What is there to love about physics and chemistry? One of the things that was most aggravating to me, he insisted that we study, that we be good students. And when we brought report cards home, if you didn't have all A's, you were going to be scolded and lectured and talked to. But if you did have all A's, for example, I came home with an A in physics, A in chemistry, and he decided or determined that if I had earned an A from the school I was attending in physics and chemistry, I should be able to pass his physics and chemistry tests. So this was routine at our house. My father made each one of us, when we were taking the subjects that he taught, it was routine for him to make us take his tests, and this was his way of ensuring that we were getting the material, that we were learning the things that we should learn. He was notorious for waking us up at 2 and 3 in the morning. He worked as a teacher by day, but he waited tables by night, the purpose of which was just to get additional money. He wanted to make sure that all of us went to college. There were 6 of us in our family. And he, just trying to feed the boys, but save money to send us to college and take care of the other needs. Those of you that have children, it's much more expensive today, but you do know what I'm saying. I thought as a child growing up that I had the meanest father and the strictest father in Birmingham, probably in Alabama. But I learned later that many of the rules that he had put in place had love behind them, and one way was teaching us discipline and trying to teach us what we would learn the hard way if we had to wait until we went out into the world. But also because as a waiter at this club, the Birmingham Country Club, which did not have black or Jewish membership in those days and still does not have black or Jewish membership today, as a waiter in that club, he had learned many things about the Klan in Birmingham. And rather than frighten us with information that he had learned, the information translated into the form of rules. For example, we learned that 2 of the bombers lived about 3 blocks up from where we lived, where we were growing up. And so the rule became that we could not, in our playing and riding our bicycles, we had a 3-block parameter for going north, south, east, or west. And all of this was designed to keep us safe and to keep us within the parameters of home where they could easily get to us. So I have, again, deep appreciation for him as a teacher, but as a father who was very protective. He did everything that he could to ensure that we grew up not only safe and unharmed, but prepared, educationally prepared, to go to college and to take our place someday as productive citizens in the economy. Well, my father was probably more strict on me than anybody else, but as I said, I could always get permission to go to church. And I just happened to be at the church when the mass meeting started. When the very first mass meeting started, I was working there in the office. I had received this job in the 7th grade. I counted our money. I took attendance on Sundays, and I summarized the report. So I happened to be in the office working on this day. We told people that our church held about 1,800 people. Today we say about 1,600. But the church was completely full, balcony and the main floor. And the students were about my age, some a little bit younger, a little younger than 14, some a little bit older than 14, 17 and 18, but it was completely full. And I decided right then and there that I wanted to be part of this, whatever was going on. I was aware through the news media and through the television, we all knew about the struggle in Birmingham, but when we came to this meeting, Dr. King explained it to us in a different way. When I stepped out into the sanctuary and sat down, there were 6 men seated on the pulpit. Those men were Dr. Martin Luther King, Reverend Ralph Abernathy, Dr. Andrew Young, Reverend Fred Shuttlesworth, Reverend Jesse Jackson, and Reverend James Bevel. Those 6 was where it all began at 16th Street Baptist Church. Dr. King started by talking to us about nonviolence, what it meant, and why it was so important that nonviolence be the mantra for the marches that were about to take place. And we were told that if we could not maintain the integrity of the nonviolent movement, that we should find a different way to be involved, that we should not march with the students. We were told to expect the police dogs. We were told to expect policemen with billy clubs, policemen that might spit on you. But we were also told that the only appropriate response ever was no response or a prayerful response. After the admonition for nonviolence came the singing of songs, and then Dr. King told us some of the things we were trying to change. One of the main things they talked about was getting the signs down, the colored and the white signs down. I was no stranger to those signs. I knew I had experienced at a very early age integration or segregation and what all of that meant. My first introduction to segregation came when my grandfather brought my grandmother to Birmingham from Clanton. She was very sick, and he had her in the backseat of the car, but hospitals in Birmingham didn't take black patients. So we were able to get my grandmother admitted to a hospital that today is known as Princeton Hospital, but in those days was known as West End Baptist Hospital. And my grandmother was taken to West End Baptist. She was placed in the basement of West End Baptist. And at that time, I was 10 years old, and both my parents had to work. So my job became sitting with my grandmother so that she would not have to be in the basement alone. The doctors would come in periodically and examine her and say things to the nurses. And there was a little white petition, I remember, that they would push in front of her when they came in, and then they would move it when they left. But I would study during the day the cobblestone floors and the sweaty pipes with the water on them. This was a true basement. It took my grandmother 2 weeks to die. She was 54 years old. But I sat in the basement for 2 weeks until she died. My second introduction to segregation came when I had the privilege of winning the citywide spelling competition in Alabama, the countywide spelling competition, and then the statewide spelling competition. But someone had determined in those days as well that black children could not attend the national spelling competition. So my fame and stardom ended with with my winning the state competition. But going back to the church, these were the things that we heard, and I wanted to say as a 14-year-old, I fully understood the things that we were trying to change. I was always a child with a very serious demeanor, and I understood very well the things that we were trying to change. So I decided that I would be one of those, that I would march with Dr. King and the other students. The very next day, someone came to my high school in Birmingham, Parker High School, and they had a big poster board sign, and all the sign said was, "It's time." Those of us that had attended the meeting and had been listening to the radio knew exactly what they meant. So we walked out of school. Some walked out of the front door, some climbed fences, but everybody made their way to what is known today as the Kelly Ingram Park area. Well, we marched from school to this area, and we were met by the policemen, the dogs, with the billy clubs and so forth. What we did not expect, what we had not been told about in the meeting, was the water hoses. And we had not been told about the little white tanks that you saw, the Army tanks. And I remember thinking to myself as the water hit me, and it hurt really, really bad. My hair came out. And I remember thinking that no one said anything about water hoses. I might have made a different decision if I'd known about water hoses. And no one said anything about little white tanks, Army tanks. Well, the records tell us that over 5,000 people marched and went to jail. The records also tell us that they ranged in ages from about 8 years old to about 80 years old. After our president, John F. Kennedy, saw these scenes in Birmingham, you remember his speech, his famous speech, where he said, are we going to make real these promises for every American citizen or just those that we choose? And so there came a Supreme Court order outlawing segregation everywhere. And a couple of weeks after that came the bombing of the 16th Street Baptist Church. I'd like to mention that before Dr. King came to Birmingham, we had our own local hero, Reverend Fred Shuttlesworth. We have recently named our airport after him. It's called the Birmingham Shuttlesworth Airport. And Reverend Shuttlesworth had worked and fought diligently prior to Dr. King coming to end segregation in Birmingham. When Dr. Shuttlesworth was marching, we were 10 years past the Brown versus Board of Education decision. And Dr. Shuttlesworth was still trying to enroll his girls in one of the local white high schools. And every time he attempted to do this, he was beaten and threatened, and mob crowds would show up and so forth. And he had had no success with that. So he tells us the story of how he invited Dr. King to come to Birmingham because he knew that inviting Dr. King would bring with it the name recognition. And so Dr. King came to Birmingham at his invitation, and this was the day that I walked into the sanctuary and saw all of them in the church there together. He also told me that they had talked the night before. They had argued quite a bit because Dr. King was told, those children are going to get hurt. You're going to get the blame for that when they get hurt. You're sending children to do adults' jobs. But James Bevel had organized the children, and he knew several things about children, and you guys know these things too. Children, number one, are plentiful. Number two, they have no jobs to lose. They're not worried about being fired if they're seen being involved in something political. And another important thing was they weren't afraid. We were not afraid. Many of the adults were afraid of losing their jobs. They were afraid of being beaten. Black people in Birmingham in general were powerless to do anything about the things that were done to them. I shared with the class this morning that bombing in Birmingham was a way of life. The bombing started in 1948 when we had neighborhoods that were separated by an imaginary dividing line in Birmingham. And a black family bought a house that crossed that imaginary dividing line. And the people on the other side of the line were very angry about that. And that's when the bombing started. So from 1948 all the way up through 1964, we had over 80 unsolved bombings. And the only one for which anybody was ever prosecuted was the one that happened on September 15th, 1963. We had come to know the sound of the bombs so well, we could be sitting on our front porch, just as we're sitting here today, and we would hear that sound. And as soon as we heard it, we knew what it was. And everyone would get quiet because you knew in a few minutes the phone would ring. And when the phone rang, somebody would say, they just bombed the A.G. Gaston Motel. Or they just bombed the house of Arthur Shores, Attorney Arthur Shores, who was one of the attorneys for the students that were arrested. So bombing was a way of life for us. It was a terrorist life. For us, it didn't start on 9/11. For us, it was a way of life in the 50s, 40s, 50s, and 60s. Well, on September 15th, the Klan had gotten word of the Supreme Court outlawing segregation, and they decided they wanted to send a message This is the testimony that we heard in court as I tell you this story. But on September 15th, I went to church with two younger brothers, Alan and Wendell. They were 6 and 10. I was secretary of our Sunday school, and I put them in their class, passed out my attendance and financial reports, and then I sat in my own class. And normally I would get up about 10:15, collect these materials, summarize these materials, and then give a report at the end of Sunday school. So this Sunday was no different. This was what I did. And when I got up to collect everything, in our church you had to pass the bathroom, which is where the girls were. You had to pass that bathroom to get upstairs to the sanctuary. And I saw my 4 friends there, and I spoke to all of them. One of the things I didn't know was that there was a 5th girl in the bathroom, Sarah, who was in a different part of the bathroom where the toilets were and the big steel doors there. We think maybe Sarah wasn't killed because she was in that part of the bathroom that had the big steel doors. But I spoke to my friends. I was excited that morning because it was youth day at our church. The lesson for that day was taken from Luke. It was a love that forgives. And the youth were in charge of the church program. We were in charge of everything. Not only that, all of the girls were friends of mine. Cynthia's father had been my elementary school principal. Denise's father was my 9th grade DE teacher. And Carol and I were Girl Scouts. We were great friends. We weren't in the same troop, but we were both Girl Scouts. And, Addie's was not my best friend, but Addie's sister, Junie, was one of my best friends. So we were excited, and Cynthia and I were in a club together, and we had put an ad in the Birmingham Times newspaper just a few days before, and that ad said, Cavalettes Club to meet September 15th at 3 p.m. Don't forget to bring your $3 for your cap and your T-shirt. To us, it was a big deal, having that little article in the paper and so forth. And then the article listed all of the names of the people that were in the club. So my name, of course, was listed, and Cynthia. And, these were good friends. We knew their families. We visited back and forth. These were not arbitrary people or people that, we go to churches today, we sometimes don't even know a lot of the people there. But the black community was very close, and we knew all of these people. Any one of them could have picked up the phone and called my house, which actually one of them did one morning. They saw me going into a little restaurant to buy something before school, and they called my dad and told him, and I was grounded for a while. But, this is how close the families were. So I left those girls in the bathroom, and I went upstairs, and as I cleared the top of the stairs, the church office was right there, and the phone was ringing. And Mrs. Shorter, who I worked under, was not in the office, so I went in and answered the phone. And there was a male caller on the other end who said 3 minutes. And as quickly as he said that, he hung up the phone. And because I was 14, because I did not know that we had had bomb threats, I really didn't know the meaning of this call. I just really didn't connect it to anything, so I just hung up the phone and took a few steps out into the sanctuary, and probably about 15 or 20 steps into the sanctuary when the bomb exploded. All of us that were present on September 15th, 1963, were required to give testimony to the FBI. In later years, when they would finish the trials with the last 2 men being convicted, I would be subpoenaed to the trials, and I would be given my FBI testimony. So a lot of what I had forgotten purposely, a lot of what I chose not to remember about that morning that I had given to the FBI was information that I had to recount and recall and answer questions about during the trial of Bobby Frank Cherry. We were forced to recall what we had been earlier taught to forget. It never occurred to me until reporters, my first recorded interview was with USA Today, but I did a lot of interviews over the years, but one day a reporter asked me, he said, what did your parents say to you after the day of the bombing? Did they talk to you? It was then that it hit me. I realized that we never talked about it. No one ever asked me, are you afraid? Do you miss your friends? Do you want to talk about what happened? And I wished when I look back on it after hearing that question, that I had someone to talk with. My two younger brothers never spoke about the bombing of the church. After that Sunday, when I stepped out into the sanctuary and the bomb exploded, my first thought was to go find those two younger brothers. So I went outside looking for them. My father had this rule. Yeah, I had a lot of rules, I told you. But if 3 people left home, 3 people had to return. There was no such thing as, I don't know where she is. I don't know where he is. And I couldn't go home without finding those 2 little boys. So I was frantically looking for them. But my father that morning this was Sunday morning, had gone to work at that club, the Birmingham Country Club, and he heard the bombing, but he didn't know that it was the church until he actually got inside, and some of the members said, they just bombed that church downtown. So he got back in the car. We only had 1 car, so he got back in the car and came back home. He knew that there was no way for my mom or anybody to get us because he had the car. And he came back to the church and found us. He encountered one of my brothers running as he came back to the church, and my smallest brother, the 6-year-old, had run some 5 or 6 blocks away, and the first man that he had encountered, he had grabbed his leg. He didn't know this man, but I just decided he was frightened out of his wits. He wouldn't turn this man loose. And back in the day, my maiden name was Maull, M-A-U-L-L, and there were only 3 of those in the phone book. So the man was able to get his phone number out of the book and call my mom, and he says, well, he won't turn me loose, but, if you can come get him, I'll just stay right here until you get here. And I think he must have been frightened beyond words. And when I think about him not having the opportunity either to ever talk about it, today we do have counselors, we have group therapy sessions and so forth, but none of us ever had the opportunity to talk about that. One of the things I wanted to read to you was, this is an eyewitness account. Keeping in mind that I was 14 years old, I'm trying to find my brothers. I find my way around the church. We're surrounded by policemen and everything. And this is a person that the church in those years was surrounded by boarding houses. And this was a person that lived in one of those boarding houses. And he wrote this account of what he saw. It's very short, but I want you to just hear the words that he used. He said, the bombing of the 16th Street Baptist Church said what we have been trying to say to the nation for years, that there exists in Alabama the most unconscionable disregard for man and God on the part of some. If white supremacy consists in the wanton and brutal destruction of worshipers of God in the very house of worship, then I must confess that the church bombers are the most supreme murderers and cowards the world has ever seen. Only the diseased mind can aspire to reach such depths. On the morning of the bombing, I stood across the street from the church behind carbine-bearing policemen and watched as the covered bodies were placed into waiting ambulances. Policemen drove a small crowd off the street. I got onto a nearby porch. Women seeing the covered bodies being brought from the church cried and screamed without restraint. I could not bring my mind to believe what my eyes saw. It still seems like a tale from some distant land where people know nothing about freedom and democracy. Now, that was just one of the people who lived in the boarding house across the street from the church, and that was his account of what he saw. In the years that followed the church bombing, I did a lot of traveling, talking about the church bombing, but I also spent, during my time in school and the years following in travel, I just spent a lot of time struggling with what we now call depression. I really didn't know what it was in those days. I just knew that I was unhappy and sad all the time. And it didn't matter. I got married. I've been married today 43 years. I have 3 adult children that I love dearly, and nothing seemed to matter back then. I was so distressed. I was trying so hard to understand why it mattered so much, what color I was, why my friends had to die. In the book, I have kind of what I call my imaginary letter that I wrote to God. I think I was probably suffering a little bit from survivor's guilt, but I wanted to know why I was not taken with the other girls. There's a 90-second window between where I was and when I left them and when the bomb exploded. And I would, in later years, just hear God calling me to come to ministry, but specifically to the ministry of reconciliation, love, forgiveness, and reconciliation. I have tried to dedicate myself to those biblical principles of love, forgiveness, and reconciliation. And one of the things that gave rise to the book was in recent years, probably in the last 5 or 6 years, I just remember that I began to hear things throughout our country that were strangely and fearfully reminiscent of things that I had heard in the 60s. And I remember thinking to myself, surely we are not going to revisit that place. We're not going to revisit those days. Surely we have learned the lessons of what happens when we teach hate. But as I listened, it appeared to me that perhaps some of those lessons we had not learned, or maybe we needed to be reminded of those lessons. So I went back and enlisted the help of a friend because I was still so very busy and traveling, but I wanted to get that book written. And so the book was an attempt to remind us of where we have already come from, to remind us of what happens when we teach hate. One of the questions that I ask, and I want to read an excerpt to you, but one of the questions, when we marched in the 60s, we carried a lot of signs. And the sign, my favorite sign, which I think still has relevance today, was a sign that said, can a man love his brother? No, can a man love God and hate his brother? About maybe 4 or 5 years ago, I think it's been 5 now, we launched a campaign on behalf of the church. I serve as president of the 16th Street Foundation, and we raised $4 million to renovate the church. And shortly after that, Attorney General Antonio Gonzalez came to Birmingham and designated us a National Historic Landmark. And we have gotten even more company since then. We have visitors at our church every single day of the year. 365 days a year, someone comes to the church from somewhere, either in the United States or outside the United States. We have inherited such an awesome legacy of hope for people and faith. And when they come through, they will ask questions about a lot of what happened in Birmingham. They will ask questions about the things that I've shared with you. And they want to know, how did you get over? How did you manage to keep going? How did you find the strength and the courage just to keep going? And we tell them the story of all of the things that happened in Birmingham. And one of our favorite songs to give them when they come is, we've come this far by faith. We've been brought too far to turn around. We're not going to stop having faith, you know, because things look dark, things look difficult for all of us. But we have the ongoing opportunity to minister to people and just to tell them everything that happened and why it's so important that we stay reminded of what happens, all of the good things that can come about when we allow love to overcome or to replace hate. So I'll read this last little excerpt to you and go from there. Chapter 17 in the book, and it's the last, kind of the last page, but it says, on June 5th, 1968, just 62 days after Dr. King's murder, Robert F. Kennedy was shot in Los Angeles. He died 26 hours later. I could hardly believe the tragic news. How many more people must die, I asked myself. I had admired and appreciated Bobby Kennedy. Like his brother John and Dr. King, Bobby had reached out to the poor and the disenfranchised, especially inner city impoverished blacks. As Attorney General and later as a senator, he had supported racial and educational equality and had asked the American people to do the same. The night Bobby Kennedy died, he had just won the California Democratic primary, which meant he had a strong chance to win the party's presidential nomination. But as with his brother, Bobby's time was cut short. Each time a man stands up for an ideal or acts to improve the lot of others or strikes out against injustice, he sends forth a tiny ripple of hope, RFK said, and crossing each other from a million different centers of energy and daring, those ripples build a current that can sweep down the mightiest walls of oppression and resistance. As U.S. Attorney General, Robert Kennedy had actively enforced the civil rights laws and was deeply committed to African Americans' equal rights to vote. On May 6th, he had traveled to the University of Georgia to deliver one of his first major talks as Attorney General. In that speech, RFK compared the domestic struggle for civil rights to the free world's fight against communism. In 1962, he had sent U.S. Marshals to Oxford, Mississippi to enforce James Meredith's enrollment in the University of Mississippi. In 1967, at the invitation of Dr. Marion Wright Edelman, Bobby Kennedy had visited the poor shanty towns in the Mississippi Delta and saw personally the plight of the poor in that area. Kennedy visited one poor family with many children and no heat, and trying to make conversation with a small boy, Kennedy asked him, "What did you have for lunch today?" "Haven't had lunch," the boy replied. Kennedy looked at his watch. "It's 3 o'clock in the afternoon, and you haven't had lunch yet?" "No," the boy said. "Sometimes we eat just one meal a day." After that visit, Kennedy returned to the White House, determined to change conditions in the Mississippi Delta and in other impoverished areas of the South. Now, he too was dead. Within the span of a decade, I had watched my beloved grandmother die in the basement of the Princeton Hospital. I had survived 2 bombings. I had seen 4 friends murdered, and I had lost 3 compassionate leaders to assassins' bullets: Dr. John F. Kennedy, Dr. Martin Luther King Jr., and Robert F. Kennedy. And I had not yet turned 21 years old. Maybe I'll end with this and just thank you for the opportunity to come and share the story and the story of the book. And as I admonished the students this morning, history is important to us. It allows us a chance to look back so that we know how to move forward. And we all should think about how we move forward. We want history to remember us kindly. When we shot several videos regarding the things that happened in Birmingham, we were contacted by the family of George Wallace. They were not very happy with the way that George Wallace was represented. But we said to them, for one moment in history, for one snapshot in time, this is who George Wallace was. The pictures say, the moving cameras, the videos say, this is who he was. Be careful how history remembers you. Think about how your grandchildren and your children will remember you. Will they be proud, or will they be ashamed of the history that you have created? This was the admonishment I left with the students this morning. I did not really feel that they needed that, but all of us have to think about the footsteps, the places that we leave in history, and how they will be interpreted, and whether we will be proud, whether our posterity and our children will be proud, or will they be ashamed. So I do thank you again for the opportunity to come and share with you today. Thank you again.